By now, you're probably all aware of the Super Game Boy. This genuine peripheral allows gamers to play their original Game Boy games on the Super Nintendo console. With its unique and ideal form factor, we had an idea. Was it possible to install a Game Boy Color within a Super Game Boy shell? Well, it certainly is. Introducing the Super Game Boy. With a little bit of planning and a lot of modding, we were able to fit an original Game Boy Color console within the Super Game Boy shell. Want to find out how? Well, stay tuned. With its ideal form factor, we knew there had to be a way to install an original Game Boy Color into the Super Game Boy shell. We first started by opening up the shell to start measuring fitment and clearances, and it was soon evident after removing the original internals that the lugs holding the original cartridge in place would have to be removed. Once happy with the overall fitment of the Game Boy Color motherboard, we set our attention on creating a template for the front faceplate buttons. This involved using a piece of 0.5mm Perspex as a template, then tracing it over with some permanent marker to transfer over to the front half of the Super Game Boy shell. We then went about creating some temporary fasteners for the Game Boy Color motherboard. In this instance, we recycled some from a Game Boy Advance SP. We also trimmed the inner workings of the cartridge to ensure that we retain both the charging port and the earphone jack. Using the template we created earlier, we're able to transfer the markings across to the rear half of the shell. Then using a Dremel tool and a hand file, gently carve out the holes for the directional pad, A and B, and start and select buttons, as well as a hole to accommodate the Q5 LCD screen, which we'll be using in this build. Once pleased with the alignment of the Game Boy Color motherboard, we transferred the mounts over to the front half of the shell and machined out any additional mounts and brackets that were a hindrance to the Game Boy Color motherboard. Using a mock motherboard, it was then time to test the fitment on the opposite half of the shell. Pleased with the positioning of the motherboard, we felt it was important to test the LCD screen before permanently mounting it to the front half of the shell. Being a purist and inspired by the Super Game Boy 2, we knew we couldn't leave out the communication port, so we desoldered an original one from the template motherboard, which would be used for this build. We then went about machining a hole which would accommodate the original communication port at the top of the console. The next part of the build involved recycling mounts from an original Game Boy Color for the directional and A and B buttons, as well as permanently mounting the screen to the shell. With the confined space of the Super Game Boy shell, the standard speaker was just too thick, so we had to replace it with an aftermarket thinner option. solder points for the Q5 backlit screen were connected. The original battery terminals were also removed in lieu for a USB-C rechargeable battery option. From the power perspective, we opted for a USB-C Pico board as well as an original DSi battery due to its thinner form factor. The top half of the shell also required additional machining to accommodate the DSi battery pack. With a little bit of creativity and soldering, the battery pack was mounted. It was just a matter of testing it before finalising the power button and communication ports. After connecting the communication port to the original Game Boy, we then opted for a micro switch in place of one of the supporting brackets. Happy with the fitment and feel of the project, it was now time to secure it shut and run it through its paces. Enjoying this video? Now's the perfect time to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. After weeks in development, we have finally completed our latest project. Introducing the Super Game Boy. Having previously built a Game Boy Pocket within an NES shell, we felt it was time to transfer the internals from a Game Boy Pocket within a Super Game Boy cartridge. For us, this mod felt organic, utilising the Super Game Boy cartridge shell. This project utilises the original Super Game Boy cartridge shell with a few extras. The console utilises the original Game Boy internals with a thinner speaker and a DSi 850mAh battery with USB-C recharging. The internals of the shell were heavily machined, and mounts from a Game Boy Advance SP were used to fix the motherboard in place. The openings for the A and B buttons were drilled out, while the directional and select and start buttons were hand filed. The console utilises the more modern 2.6-inch Q5 IPS backlit screen and is accented by a black glass screen bezel. Gameplay seems somewhat more comfortable with the oversized shell and has that similar feel to the original Game Boy Advance console. A micro power switch was hidden at the top of the console within the cartridge mounts, as well as the original communication port. After weeks in production, we're genuinely pleased with the overall result. The use of the original Super Game Boy shell was a perfect choice and reduced build time. Using a non-functional Super Game Boy cartridge not only reduced the need to build a custom shell, but was also quite cheap at only $5. This mod only proves that if you're on a budget, have a little bit of time and ingenuity, you too can have a one-off custom console. We hope that this video has given you the insight and knowledge to create your own custom console. Enjoyed this video? Don't forget to check out our other custom consoles on our YouTube channel. And subscribe for weekly updates. Until then, stay safe.